Bardzo proszę, panie sekretarzu.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I appreciate very much the opportunity and invitation that you extended to me. And I want to thank the members who are assembled here today for giving me your time and the opportunity to exchange views. As I traveled in from the airport this morning, I couldn't help but think of one of my first visits to Europe, then as governor of the state of Iowa. I traveled to France with the governor of Oklahoma and our spouses. And the purpose of the trip was to review the early childhood commitment that the French people had made to their youngest. We wanted to replicate that in the United States because we recognized the importance of young children's education. We were at a preschool, and it was the mid-morning session at a time for a snack. And I think the governor of Oklahoma and I were quite surprised when the china came out and the youngsters were given fruits and vegetables. Now, these were 3- and 4-year-old youngsters. And I can tell you that my wife and I would not have trusted our 3- and 4-year-old children with china. And we were impressed with the quality of the food that was being presented and provided to these youngsters. And I think it impressed upon me the extraordinary level of respect that people in France, and I think it is fair to say in Europe, have for food and for those who produce food. And we in the United States are now in the process of trying to once again replicate that effort with our Healthy Hunger Free Kids initiative, which the First Lady, Michelle Obama, has championed, because we want our youngsters to be well fed and to get a good start in life. So it impresses me with the fact that we are often more alike than different in food and agriculture, and I look forward to this opportunity to exchange views so that I can underscore that concept. Let me begin by pointing out that I think that we are indeed, and certainly the farmers of my country, are very much like the farmers in Europe. Both farmers here and in the United States are very proud of their roots. They are a believer in hard work. They are committed to sustainability. They understand the responsibility and duty they have to future generations to farm the land and to produce the food. They are proud of the fact that they are part of an effort to feed not only the people of their country, but peoples all over the world, and recognize that they have a responsibility as it relates to global food security. They are interested, as I suspect every farmer in every country is, in new or expanding market opportunities. They also recognize that the ability to produce food in a changing climate is going to become more challenging. The issue of climate change is something I'll be discussing in a couple of days in Paris when I visit the COP meeting to discuss the steps that the United States is taking in agriculture to reduce our emissions and to become more sustainable. We believe we can double our rate of emission reduction in agriculture with a voluntary-based, incentive-based system. Our farmers, as is the case in Europe, I think, are challenged by changing climate, but they're also challenged by changing consumer tastes and the need for new products. And that's why agriculture requires flexibility and innovation. One message that I want to deliver today to this group is that American agriculture is often not well understood in the United States, and perhaps it is also not as well understood overseas. There are some in the U.S. who believe that American agriculture is one large production-sized farming operation. That's simply not the case. I come from a state that consists of primarily family farming operations of small farms. We in the United States Department of Agriculture over the last 7 years that I've been Secretary have really focused on encouraging greater diversity within American agriculture. While it is true that many farmers in the United States use genetically modified crops, it is also true that other farmers, and a growing number of farmers, are in the organic business and are using more traditional methods of production. It is certainly true that we have diversity in the crops that are produced, from commodity crops to specialty crops, and we're now beginning to see conservation as a crop. It's also true that there are varying sizes of farming operations. We now have a very aggressive effort to encourage local and regional food systems in the U.S., which is catering to farms that can be 5, 10, 15 acres in size. And we obviously have greater diversity in operators, making a major effort to encourage women into American agriculture. So I hope that I'm able, during the course of our visit today, to encourage the notion that American agriculture is not monolithic. It is, in fact, a very diverse agriculture. We are all faced with a tremendous challenge, and that challenge is to meet the global food needs of a rising global population. It has been estimated that we'll need to expand food production by 60 to 70% in the next 30 to 40 years. That is a daunting task, and even more so with a changing climate. That's why the U.S. has begun taking a look at ways in which we can research and create, through science, innovations that will allow us to be more productive. It's why we have embraced precision agriculture, recognizing that every acre or hectare of land that is being farmed is not necessarily the same as an adjoining hectare or acre. We're now beginning to learn more about the character of each acre, which allows us to understand what seeds to use, how much fertilizer to use, how much chemicals to apply, if at all, and how to preserve scarce water resources through precision agriculture. We also recognize that it's not just about increasing production, it's making better use of the food that we do produce. That's why we have joined many nations in calling for an international effort to reduce food waste. Nearly a third of the food that is produced in the world is wasted for a variety of reasons. In the case of the United States, it's often because there's too much on our plates. We don't figure out often how to reuse or recycle. In developing countries, it may be a result of improper storage. But in any event, it is a global need for us to focus on reducing food waste. And we do believe that part of global food security also is addressed through free and fair trade agreements. In the United States, we see trade agreements as providing stabilization for crop prices and therefore for farm income. We know it's a job creator. In my country, over 1 million jobs are directly related to agricultural exports. Of the 11 million jobs that are export-related in our overall economy, we believe it promotes innovation, and we believe it also strengthens relationships. We've had some experience with that last point. In the North American Free Trade Agreement, I was surprised to learn how well all three countries in that agreement have done in terms of agriculture. Mexico, Canada, and the United States have all seen increases in trade activity, and they've been pretty much balanced, and an opportunity for farmers in all three countries to benefit. We've just recently concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. We think there is enormous opportunity for not just American farmers, not just for the members of the TPP, but potentially as well for farmers in Europe to meet an expanding middle class. The middle class in Asia is a phenomenon. Today, 535 million middle-class consumers in Asia. In just 15 years, it is projected that number could grow by 2.7 billion people, which will provide great opportunity for farmers around the world. And we think that the TPP negotiations have provided an opportunity for us to gain momentum in the important conversations that we're going to have with Europe in the TTIP negotiations. We think there are benefits to both the United States and to Europe in TTIP, but I recognize that there are some serious challenges. Some very, very difficult decisions and conversations will have to take place. We approach food safety in a slightly different way. There is a discussion here of the precautionary principle. In the United States, it's a risk-based assessment. These are oftentimes seem to be different, but in fact they all have the same potential outcome, which is safe food for consumption. We understand that there is a need for protection of value-added propositions that oftentimes comes with a location of a crop having grown or been raised or established in a particular geographic area. You all have geographic indications which provides that value-added protection. In the United States, we have trademarks Again, different systems, but the goal is designed to try to provide protection for value added. We recognize that in sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, that science should create an objective standard so that there can be transparency and predictability. In many countries, I just recently came from China, where there is a discussion of a broader array of concerns being focused in SBS regulations, including political considerations. That creates for us some significant difficulties. So there are obviously significant differences between our systems. But I think the key message that I want to deliver today is that, in my view, it's not really ultimately about getting identical systems. It's about getting equivalent systems. We can get to the same place using different routes and different roads so long as the goal is the same. And I think the goal is the same: an adequate supply of food that's produced in a sustainable way, that's safe for consumption, and that meets the needs of our people and the glowing food needs of a glowing world population. You know, we obviously value the European products in the U.S. Just take wine and cheese, for example. Over $5 billion of European wine and cheese is sold in the U.S., and I would expect that if TTIP is enacted, that number will certainly not go down and will most likely go up. That contrasts to about $500 million of U.S. wine and cheese that is sold here in Europe. So I think there's an opportunity here for continued strong European sales in the U.S., an opportunity for the U.S. To perhaps have a chance to compete in this market. But at the end of the day, your consumers are going to make the right choice for themselves. And I sincerely hope that we have an opportunity to at least give them a choice. You know, these are interesting discussions, and I'm sure that we'll have a number of comments and questions here about a variety of issues. But I just simply want to leave you with a couple of points. One is that American agriculture is indeed diverse, is indeed not monolithic, and is in many cases evolving into a system that provides opportunities for large production facilities, but also for very, very small facilities. Two, we have mutual responsibility relative to global food security that must be met in part through science, in part through precision agriculture, in part through avoiding waste, but the trade agreements have a critical role to play. And then finally, as it relates to our negotiations, I have no illusion how difficult this is going to be, but I hope that we are committed to finding a way to make sure that we don't necessarily require of each other identical systems, but equivalent systems that ultimately get to the same place, but use a different way or a different route. Our consumers will benefit. Our job seekers will benefit, our farmers will benefit, and our relationship between the EU and the United States will absolutely be strengthened. And as the Chairman suggested, and I'll finish with this, as the Chairman suggested, this isn't just an agreement for the EU and the United States. This is about high standards. It's about sending a message to the rest of the world about what a high standards trade agreement looks like and must contain. Rather than a race to the bottom and the common denominator, we need to be providing leadership to the rest of the world to raise sights. And I look forward to receiving comments from the presenters today and then being able to respond to as many questions as time permits. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję, panie sekretarzu.
Thank you very much. And according to our tradition, we will now move on to our speakers. First of all, political group coordinators. Then your answers, and then we will move on to the remaining members of Parliament. So 2 minutes per coordinator and 1 minute for all other members. I am sorry about these time restrictions, but that's all the time we have. Mr. Dess, on behalf of the European People's Party.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here with us here in Brussels, explaining what's happening in American agriculture and allowing us to ask questions. When I went to the USA, I saw that there are obviously larger, smaller companies. I mean, I saw a farm with just 10 milk cows. But I think on average, normally it's 10 times, farms are 10 times as bigger there than they are here. So 160,000 hectares. There is a big difference, therefore, between farms here and there. In the press release in the USA, there's a bill being pushed through saying that around 960 billion dollars rather, 7.8 billion euros will be given to agriculture. I would like to know what sort of ways that money will be given. It's not going to be direct payments, is it? Otherwise, that would mean 400 euros per hectare for each hectare in the USA. So, I mean, I've only got 2 minutes, but I am in favor of an agreement with the United States, but we do need the right conditions. When I hear about negotiations going on, I'm hearing about an import license system. With this sort of system, having it in a trade agreement, well, I'm not sure that I could agree to that, being from this committee, the Agriculture Committee. I can imagine these higher limits being laid down, but an import license system, I think, isn't the right way forward. We need mutual recognition of bio-organic seals. I have other questions. I'm afraid I can't get them to you today, but I will get them to you in writing. Thank you much indeed, and I will thank you in advance for the answers.
Thank you very much, Mr. De Castro.
Grazie, Presidente. Grazie al Ministro.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Minister, for being here with us today. It's the first time that you've been to the European Parliament, I believe, and I really think that provides important recognition to our institution. I was very pleased to hear what you have had to say. It really highlighted many aspects of agriculture in the United States, and these are things that we don't often hear about here. I don't have a lot of time, and I'm going to just raise 2 questions as a result. One relates to TTIP, of course. This committee expressed itself via an opinion prepared by a colleague, Jim Nicholson, and we made some comments on the risks and opportunities that TTIP may provide for our farmers. But there is one point that I wanted to raise. Between the United States and Europe, we have a third of global trade. We have over 700 billion euros worth of services and goods that are traded between us. And that's without TTIP coming into force. So we're 2 important economic powers. But given that significant role of our various countries, don't you think that a system of labelling which was clearer would be good for American consumers as well as for our producers? I mean, that would mean that American consumers would no longer have to consume products believing that they're Italian, French, Greek or whatever, but they're actually, whereas they're actually produced in the United States. I mean, wouldn't that fulfill the objectives of the US and Europe at the same time? I mean, I know that GIs is a hot potato in this committee, and that's why I want to bring it up. Now, a more general point with regard to the recent reforms in the Farm Bill. You've replaced direct aid with a mechanism of protection via mutual funds and insurance systems. So the question is, how have American farmers experienced this major change? Because we recently reformed our common agricultural policy, and we may have to re-review it in a few years' time. And the issue of crisis management is something that recurs again and again in this committee. Thank you very much.
Mr. Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Can I add my welcome to you, to this committee, and I have no doubt we have fairly straight talking to each other. I recently met with a number of your congressmen and senators, and officials in Washington, it became clear from the conversations I had with them that agriculture will, at the end of the day, no matter what else you talk about in TTIP, will make or break TTIP, whether it succeeds or falls. And the one thing that is the same both sides of the pond is if they're not farmers, there'll be no food. If the farmers who's producing the food don't get a proper standard of living, then they won't be there. And then they'll all be in trouble. So there's a big challenge to us all. And the one thing I don't want is that our agri-food sector becomes a bargaining chip in these ongoing negotiations. I think we have a situation on both sides, and I would be like Mr. Dess. I would be prepared to give this, and we all have our sectors and the different sectors, and I am certainly not going to stand by, and I have to be very blunt and honest with you, and see the suckler cow beef herds in Europe wiped out, because that is what could happen. And I'm not going to stand back and allow that to happen. I'm going to defend them to the best, as I would expect you to defend from your side as well. We all have our offensive and defensive positions. But there's a lot to be gained for everybody in a successful agreement. And if I may conclude, because I don't want to overrun my time if I can possibly do that, I believe that if we can get it right in TTIP, there is a huge advantage for both of us in the European Union and in the United States. But it will take time to achieve that deal. I don't believe it is going to come be achieved overnight. It will take time to achieve it. But it has got to withstand protest, because there's a large opposition and misinformation in Europe about TTIP at this present moment in time. We need a fair and balanced deal, and we may have to park some of the more contentious issues that you referred to to actually get that deal at the end of the day. Thank you.
Pan poseł Rohde.
Mr. Rohde.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for your introduction and your kind words about European products. I agree with you that we have serious discussions ahead of us, but on behalf of the Liberal Party, your sister party here in Europe, I would stress the need to step up talks to get this free trade deal done. There are benefits to be had on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm very happy to hear that Americans value products from especially European dairy sector. But in that respect, Washington's move to slap high duties on EU butter and cream exports needs to be rethought. I'm sorry to say, but it is a bit difficult not to question America's commitment to free trade when it hits the EU dairy industry with increased duties on EU butter and cream exports. And I would very much like your comment on that. Thank you.
Pani poseł Senra.
Mrs. Senra.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Minister, I have 3 questions for you. Firstly, you said that in the United States, small and medium-sized farms are supported. You mentioned farms that are 5, 10, 20 hectares in size. I want to know which mechanism you use to support and protect these small farms. You also said that you wanted to feed the Asian middle class. That was your aspiration. Well, I imagine that Asian farmers want to do the same. They want to feed their people. So could you explain to me via which mechanisms and policies are you going to achieve that? And the third question relates to the TTIP negotiations. I'd like to know whether there is transparent debate with your citizens. And secondly, you mentioned the diversity of agriculture. So I'd like to ask what the position of small and medium-sized farms is on TTIP. Thank you.
Pan poseł Hausling.
Thank you very much, Minister, for coming. As you know, in Europe we're having quite a critical discussion on TTIP. Agriculture, farmers and consumers, everybody together. Studies just come to light showing that American agriculture will be the main profiteer of this agreement. There'll be 5.5 billion euros extra going to the other side of the Atlantic. So I don't think we can really promise very much for us for TTIP. For example, gene technology. Our rules on gene technology, for example, are they seen as trade obstacles to trade, or do you see that European consumers have a different opinion of gene technology? The use of hormones in farming, for example. You can't have American meat consumed here that's been treated with hormones, for example, and labeling of clones, for example. We have tried to, with a huge majority here in Parliament, we were in favour of this labelling. You said that everything has to be looked at from a scientific point of view. Well, of course, it's a scientific discussion, but also we have to take on board what consumers want. If consumers don't necessarily want something, then we have to respect that as legislators. You talked about labelling. I can support this. We do need clearer labelling rules, especially for GIs, so that consumers have a choice at the end of the day, and they can buy products from the various regions. And my last question, you talked about the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. You mentioned that briefly. In your country, in your party, is there any discussion as to whether this is going to benefit everybody? The agreement isn't done and dusted yet. So do you think there's going to be extra discussions before everything is signed on the dotted line? Thank you.
Pan poseł Agnew. Panie pośle, bardzo proszę.
Mr. Agnew has the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. I support what Jim Nicholson said to the American Secretary of State for Agriculture, and I've got 7 quick points. It's mainly about poultry meat. The first is legal certainty. In Britain, our standards for our poultry producers have to be enforced by law. It's different in the US. It's a matter of negotiation between the producer and the customer. In this scenario, it would be quite easy for processors in Britain to undermine the British producer. The next is equivalence. You mentioned this, but we're not at all convinced in Britain that American standards in terms of health and welfare are as good as British standards. Could you comment on this? Do you agree or disagree? Third is antibiotics. A lot of antibiotics used in US intensive livestock. We don't like using them on a general basis. Can you comment on antibiotic use? Chemicals. In Britain, we don't accept that chemical decontamination of carcasses is either necessary or acceptable, particularly in the idea of a farm-to-fork approach. Free-range eggs. The definition of a free-range egg in Britain is it must have a brown shell and it must not be washed. In America, the definition is it must have a white shell and it must be washed. Who's going to win this battle? Because if you win, our free-range egg sector is going to be massively undermined. Do you feed pig swill in the United States? You talked about waste. Does that go into animal feed rations? It used to in Britain, but it's not allowed anymore. Similar, abattoir waste, meat and bone meal, mammalian protein fed back to mammals. Does that occur in the United States or not? Thank you.
W tej chwili byśmy oddali głos.
I think we can now give the floor to Mr. Secretary so that he can refer to the questions put by the coordinators, and then we'll give the floor to the individual MEPs.
Well, I appreciate the wide range of questions, and I'll do my best to try to be as responsive as I can. Let me begin by discussing where monies for farm assistance go in the U.S., which was the first set of questions posed to me. The $8 billion that was mentioned, there are four major areas of assistance the U.S. provides. One is crop insurance, where essentially it's a partnership between the government and the producer and an insurance company. Depending upon the level of production that the farmer wants, the government pays a certain percentage of the premium for crop insurance. If there is a disaster, obviously the farmer gets paid based on the level of coverage. If there's profit that's generated from the sale of these insurance products, it is shared by the companies that sell the products and by the government. If there is a loss, as there has been the last couple of years because of drought, the government again shares some of the loss responsibility with the companies. The goal here is to provide enough protection for producers that they are not devastated by a single year or two of bad crop production. Supplementing and complementing the crop insurance program is what we refer to as the agricultural risk coverage program, or the price loss coverage program. This provides a degree of supplemental protection for farmers in the U.S. should prices go down precipitously as a result of market conditions. This doesn't guarantee a profit for producers, but it guarantees that they can stay in business if they are faced with significant losses as a result of prices coming down. Recently, we have seen, for example, with the avian influenza outbreak in the U.S., that had an impact, obviously, on grain sales and grain prices. The result is that it's likely that farmers in the U.S. will receive some payment under the ARC and PLC program because of lower prices, something that they couldn't have anticipated, something that they couldn't have controlled. And something that's not covered by crop insurance, since crop insurance is really designed at dealing with issues involving Mother Nature. So it's a good complement, and it provides, I think, a level of protection that is appropriate. Additional resources are provided to producers to encourage conservation. We have a number of cost-share programs. And then within the livestock area, with the exception of the poultry industry, we have a disaster program. If forage is lost as a result of drought, or if there's a storm, or there's a serious problem that results in the death of livestock, we have a disaster assistance program that provides assistance and help. And it's based on a formula. So those are the four main areas of assistance that are provided. There are a variety of other programs, but I think that gives you a sense of what we're about. The issue of GIs obviously is a very important one to the EU. It's a very important one to the U.S. The position, I think, of the U.S. is that there are certain terms, certain identifiers of products have become so generic and used so commonly that it would be difficult to have American consumers understand the significance of changing that system. That's why we have suggested the possibility of a trademark process in which those who seek to protect a particular product from a particular area in Europe could do so through a trademark. I'm thinking of Parmesan cheese from the Reggiano area in Italy. I think there are 8 or 9 different trademarks that have been utilized by producers of that particular cheese to make sure that people in our grocery stores understand that when they're purchasing that product, they're purchasing it from Italy. That is obviously an area of conversation and discussion that will take place, and it's one that obviously will be not easy to resolve. But I believe that if enough time and thought and enough communication takes place, that we can find a way to protect the interests of those who are interested in a value-added proposition without necessarily making it impossible for producers in either the EU or the United States to continue to be in business. The question was asked as to whether or not farmers in the U.S., how they were reacting to the new Farm Bill. I think that they were very appreciative of the fact that the new Farm Bill, which established the ARC and PLC program, the disaster assistance programs, and the conservation programs, I think they were very pleased with the fact that it was implemented within a year. It was the best implementation we've seen in a farm bill probably in the last 6 or 7 farm bills, and I think producers are, for the most part, pleased. We also have a dairy margin protection program where we are providing some assistance for dairy producers. They can essentially purchase a level of insurance against declining costs and prices. When the differential between what they get for their milk and what they are paying for feed gets below a certain level, some assistance can kick in. The jury's still out on whether or not our dairy producers are pleased with that because there are regional differences between feed costs which were not factored into the original program by Congress. So there may be some work there, but I think on balance our farmers are probably okay with the reforms that have come into place. You know, in trade, I think it's fair to say that agriculture is always the last issue to be resolved in any trade agreement. That was certainly true in the recently concluded TPP negotiations. I think dairy was the last thing that was discussed and ultimately agreed upon. I would anticipate and expect that with reference to the issues that we face in TTIP, that we'll probably be talking about a number of ag issues for a considerable period of time. And I think part of it is because of the level of culture that is involved in agriculture. It's not just the production of a product. It's something that is very basic to the people of each country that's represented here, and certainly basic to each region of my country. People are identified with what they grow and what they raise, and they feel very, very personally. It's personal to them. The challenge for us in the U.S. in terms of agriculture and trade agreements is that agriculture is not large enough politically, powerful enough politically to be able to get an agreement passed, but they are certainly powerful enough to stop an agreement. So if there is not adequate attention paid to the agricultural interests in a trade agreement, then oftentimes those trade agreements are very difficult to get through the process. So, for example, if the idea were to have a TTIP agreement that did not include agriculture, that set aside agriculture because it was just too difficult to reach a conclusion, it may very well be that that agreement couldn't get significant support in the Congress as it currently exists. That's why it's important for us to sort of work through these tough issues. I really appreciate the comment about farmers and the fact that if they aren't in business, then we don't eat. Another way of saying this is, with the exception of those who are actually farmers in this room and in any other room, the rest of us have delegated the responsibility to feed our families to farmers. And I suspect that we didn't even give much thought to that delegation. We grew up, in my case, I grew up wanting to be a lawyer. My wife grew up wanting to be a teacher. She was able to pursue her dream. I was able to pursue my dream. My kids are able to pursue their dreams as lawyers and nonprofit owners of an entity that does international work. We were able to pursue that dream because we've delegated the responsibility of feeding our family to a relatively small number of people globally. And frankly, those folks don't get enough attention and don't get enough appreciation for that, at least in my country. And at the same time, at least in my country, the cost of food is such that that it's a relatively small amount of the overall paycheck that people earn in the U.S., which means that at least for poor people, that there's a greater availability, a greater opportunity, especially with our food assistance programs. And so we don't appreciate that either, and we should. So I appreciate that being brought up. Look, there are a number of issues relative to products that are produced in the U.S. using different methods, and I understand that some folks are not interested in having hormone beef. I understand that some folks aren't interested in some of the pathogen reduction treatments that are used in the U.S. on poultry. I guess our position on this, and I don't expect anybody necessarily to agree with this today, but our position on this is that consumers are pretty wily, consumers are pretty smart, consumers know what they want, and they can make the right choice. And frankly, if a market is open and I attempt to sell something that no consumer in the European Union wants to buy, I suspect I will probably do one of two things. I will probably stop trying to sell it in the market, or I will change my product. That's the evolution and the nature of markets. And so to our way of thinking, it's better for the consumer to make the choice than it is necessarily for the government to make the choice. That does require a level of transparency. It does require providing information to consumers so they can make an informed choice. And therein, I think we have an area of conversation and discussion of what does that look like, how can we convey enough information to producers or to consumers to allow them to make a choice. And the butter issue is one that we saw a 150% increase in imports into the U.S. We felt that we were within our WTO right. We actually imposed a level of a tariff that is significantly below what the WTO has authorized and allowed. It expires on December 31st of this year, and so it was a measured effort to try to respond to what we perceived to be a significant increase in imports that we hadn't seen for some time. I understand and appreciate that there's concern about this. This has been expressed to me by Commissioner Hogan on a number of occasions, and I've tried to make sure that he understands that this is limited, both in scope and in time. Questions were asked about how we're helping our small and mid-sized producers. We have a thing called Know Your Farmer. It's an effort to try to provide assistance in the following ways. We created a microloan program that provides up to $50,000 worth of credit for producers that are in smaller operations. We've created a tunnel house conservation program that allows the growing seasons to be extended with basically temporary greenhouse operations. We have provided assistance in the form of marketing information and pricing information for specialty crops that allows these smaller producers to understand precisely how best to price their product. We have created support for food hubs, which is an aggregation of this locally and regionally produced food. And then we have created opportunities for those food hubs to do business with our schools, for example. We have a farm-to-school program. We've provided over 220 grants to schools around the United States, roughly 6.5 million youngsters impacted by these grants, that allows people to understand how to procure, how to understand what is being grown and raised in their area, and how to establish contracts for the purchase of this. All of this is designed to provide help and assistance to local producers who are smaller, and it's designed to create a different market. The reality is that small producers will always have a hard time on a commodity-based market because commodity-based markets reward efficiency and technology. Our view is that if we create a process by which these local and small producers can have a personal relationship with their customer may be willing to pay a penny or two more a bushel for whatever it is they're selling because they like the relationship, they like knowing who their farmer is, they like knowing where their food comes from, and they're willing to pay a premium for that. And we want to set up a market opportunity for that to happen so that we, again, support diversity within American agriculture. Our view about the TPP and the Asian middle class is the point was just to point out the fact that there's going to be a tremendous need for food generally. Right now, we're not on pace to produce enough food to feed all the people who are going to need food, and we're not on pace necessarily to produce all of the protein that a rising middle class in Asia is going to want to consume. And it's not necessarily going to be at the expense of Asian producers. I was in China last week, and they are moving 10 million farmers off the land every single year. I don't know how they're going about doing that. It seems to me to be an incredible challenge from a societal standpoint. But they recognize that their agriculture at this point in time is not adequate to meet the demands of their population. And their population is obviously going to increase. We've had same conversations with our friends in Vietnam and in Malaysia and in Korea and in Japan. They all understand the challenge that we face. And the key here, I think, is that there's going to be a tremendous amount of business opportunity in agriculture that isn't necessarily going to be a zero-sum game. It doesn't necessarily mean that because I'm selling to Asia, it necessarily comes at the expense of European producers. I think there's enough business for all of us. And I think there's clearly going to be enough business for us in the foreseeable future relative to protein because of this incredible increase And at the same time that this is happening, we're going to see climate change where products are grown, how much is grown, what's grown. Growing seasons are going to change. In my country, we're growing corn in one area of the country. 40 years from now, we may not be able to grow corn in that area. We may be growing some other product. And I think we can anticipate a shift because of climate, which is why we're focused on trying to provide our farmers with adaptation and mitigation strategies for dealing with that. The question was asked about transparency in these trade agreements. I can't speak about any other country other than the U.S., but we recently passed the Trade Promotion Authority Act, which basically requires that any trade agreement that is negotiated by an administration is required to be placed on the web for everyone to view, and that there is a considerable amount of time between the time that is placed on the web for everyone to review and when Congress is required or is enabled to make a decision on it. The reality is these trade agreements are going to be discussed and debated for an extended period of time because they're complicated. The TPP is 1,000 pages long. I would imagine TTIP will be that and then some. There are provisions, calculations, methods of determining the impact 5, 10, 15, 20 years out in these agreements. So there will be transparency, at least in the U.S. Everyone's going to see exactly what's been negotiated. Everyone's going to be given time to make a decision as to whether or not it makes sense for them and for their sector. Let me just try to summarize a couple other issues. And there was a question about, or an issue raised about antimicrobial resistance, and that's a very important question. And we are in the process of developing a system in which we're reducing significantly the level of antibiotics being used in livestock. We are now working with our veterinarians for the judicious use of antibiotics, not using them as growth promotion, but as a treatment of disease and illness in animals. We are researching to basically understand how this resistance develops. And we are making a concerted effort between the medical doctors and our animal doctors so that we have a One Health approach to this. We recognize this is an issue. We recognize it's a problem, and we're trying to address it fairly aggressively. The President has signed an executive order directing his departments to work collaboratively, and we are working with our Health and Human Services Department to do so. Questions have been raised about GIs, GMOs, hormones as it relates to TTIP and whether or not there is any way of resolving the differences between us on these issues. I'm not here to tell you it's going to be easy. It won't be. It's going to be very difficult. But it will require, I think, time. It will require a commitment to try to get to a solution that works for folks. It will require a real basic understanding of precisely what the systems are and what the goals are. And it will require, I think, a bit of creativity on the part of folks to figure out ways in which we can get a system that works. Because at the end of the day, it's been our history and it's been our experience that these trade agreements don't necessarily result in one country benefiting at the expense of other countries. That's certainly not the case in NAFTA on agriculture. We don't expect it to be the case in TPP in terms of our Asian partners, and we would not expect and anticipate, because if that is what happens in a trade agreement, then the trade agreement has failed. That's not a solid trade agreement. A solid trade agreement is an agreement in which everyone is given an opportunity to compete effectively, and then consumers are given terrific choice. They're given diversity. They're given variety. They're given less cost and less expense, and then they ultimately can make it. And all of us are then spurred to figure out creative ways and innovative ways to improve our products. That's what we see the benefit of free trade agreements to being. And so we would expect nothing less with TTIP should we be able to get this passed. We are having a debate right now on labeling in the United States, and I think I have been out and sort of suggesting that we're having a 20th century conversation in the 21st century when it comes to labeling. At least in my country, there are a substantial number of young people who have smartphones and have technology and use them extensively. I think that there is an opportunity for us to use extended barcodes, QR codes, and alike to provide a wealth of information about products so that consumers can make informed choices, but to do it in a way that doesn't necessarily send the wrong message about the safety or viability of a product. We obviously are of the position that GMOs do not present a health risk. Some folks in this audience may disagree with that, but we think the science on that is clear. But if consumers want that information, then we have to figure out a way to provide it to them in a way that doesn't send the wrong message about the safety of a product. In the U.S., we label for nutrition, we label for known risks. So if we're talking about a traditional label, it's neither nutrition or, in our view, a known risk. It is information that consumers want. So let's figure out a way to get it to them that doesn't discourage the product, but gives people the ability to go into a grocery store and make an informed decision. And I think eventually we're going to get to that kind of labeling system, and maybe that's an opportunity for us to have a conversation here as well so that people do have the information that they need to make informed choices. I know that the time is short, and I'll just make reference on the BSE issue. We recognize issues relative to what livestock is being fed, and we have been very aggressive in this effort to try to prevent the wrong things from being fed to livestock to reduce significantly the risk of BSE, and the OAE has recognized us as a negligible risk country, and we're reopening beef markets as we speak. And you know, these definitional issues are important, but they aren't necessarily, in my view anyway, they're not necessarily impossible to solve. You know, the free range issue, there's got to be a way to figure that out in a way that producers who want brown eggs can get the brown eggs, and the producers who are comfortable with white eggs can get the white eggs. There needs to be a way to do this, and it's just a matter of us sitting down and figuring it out. So,
Zakończyliśmy pierwszą część.
We have now concluded the first part of our discussion, and now we will move to individual members. Each of you will have 1 minute. Try not to repeat what the others have already said. So try to be as brief as possible. Mr. Dorfmann.
Ja, danke, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, Secretary of State, for the time that you are dedicating to us. Just a specific question on TTIP, if I may, and the SPS rules in particular. Now, in the US, you continue to have major difficulties in seeing the EU as a whole bloc, and a lot of the SPS arrangements look at the EU as a motley crew of 28 member states without accepting that when it comes to food safety, it's an EU-level competence. There are uniform rules and regulations that apply there. And, of course, it's up to the member states to implement those rules, but those rules are at EU level, and in the US it's similar. You have federal rules that are applied then by the individual states. And in Europe, we wouldn't dream of not seeing the US as one country, as a whole. We wouldn't go and support particular states over others, for example. So do you think under TTIP we might now have a new arrangement where you see the EU as a bloc rather than as a collection of states? Thank you.
Pan poseł Erdos.
Köszönöm szépen, tisztelt miniszter úr, talán az európai gazdaság.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. I think that the major market would be for products which are protected. How would you like to make it impossible to get counterfeit products? Could you please tell us about that? My second question is as follows. I must say that as far as Hungary is concerned, when it comes to arbitration, we are afraid of poultry treated by chlorine or, for instance, GMOs. Let's suppose that Hungary is not going to allow them into the market, but we are afraid that we've got to pay fines. How would you like to stop this? Thank you.
Pan poseł Andrieu.
Mr. André.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à vous, Monsieur le Secrétaire.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to you as well, Secretary of State. It's good to hear that there is a major difference between the rules as you've explained them to us and what we do in Europe. But I too would like to come back to TTIP with a specific question. The second round of negotiations in October was the subject of an exchange of tariff proposals. But we will only benefit from lower rates if, in SPS terms, certain conditions are met. Now, if you look at the non-tariff side of things, then there's a point that you mentioned yourself, which is GIs, and the fact that those need to be respected. Now, you mentioned it, but we'd like you to go further in that. And could you tell us what specific problems you have with geographic indications? What is the true problem in the US in accepting those as we see them?
Dziękuję. Pani poseł Hans Garcia.
Madame Erans Garcia.
Sí, muchas gracias por estar aquí esta.
Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. I have a couple of questions. Firstly, do you not believe it would be useful for, in Europe, public legislation to be developed such on food defence along the lines of US legislation? Because we don't have legislation along those lines. We just have optional guidelines there. And a second question, don't you believe that a US gesture recognising European GIs would be important, because that would be the only way for EU agricultural policy to really be a part of the TTIP agreement? I mean, for example, Piedmont in Italy produces a certain wine, and the same takes place with Malaga, Jerez wines, etc. They are produced in the area where they are. They have the label from the area from which they're produced.
Poseł Corti.
Thank you, Chairman, and you're welcome, Mr. Vilsack. I'm an Irish MEP, so you won't be surprised to hear that I have two questions, and both of them relate to beef. The first one is in relation to the TTIP negotiations. At the moment, as you know, the US has a 45,000-tonne duty-free tariff quota for non-hormone beef into the EU. What's your wish? I don't expect you to go into your negotiation stand, but what would you like that figure to be raised to in terms of the amount of US beef to enter the European market post-TTIP? And the second question is an Irish-specific question. You were in Ireland a number of times, and on one particular occasion when there was great fanfare to the fact that the US market was going to be opened up to Irish beef. And at that time, our own minister, and I think some of his counterparts in the US, estimated that the US market would be worth up to €100 million per year in terms of for Irish beef producers. But in the first 6 months of this year, exports from Ireland to the US of beef were worth only €194,000. What's your own view as to the reasons why that figure is so low, and do you believe that it will increase, and what do you believe will need to happen in order for that to increase substantially?
Herr Minister, ich komme aus einer kleinen.
Secretary of State, I come from a small mountainous region which has important products which are protected. We have a number of protected cheeses with geographic indications, and our farmers, our companies, our holdings, and our family-run buildings will be the main ones to lose out under TTIP. In our discussions with the Commissioner dealing with trade, we've heard that on the US side, there won't be concessions, or many concessions, on the agricultural side, and we feel that you've not said enough today about cloning. In Europe, this is not a technology that we want, so I'd like to know from you whether you'll be labeling your foodstuffs, whether it will be possible, is it in an animal husbandry register, for example, and I'd like to know how many farmers in the US are involved in organic farming. How many organic holdings do you have? Is that a significant movement? We talk about animal welfare a great deal. We want more of that. And I think that that runs counter to the current TTIP negotiations. Thank you.
Pan poseł Haitoma.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And thank you very much, Secretary of State, for being here. For me, it interests very much the Farm Bill. And indeed, the latest Farm Bill focuses much more on risk management. I was wondering, what is the reason to do so? Why did you change your policy on that? And also, what is the effect on your budget? And will you spend also more money on research and innovation, not only on, for example, precision farming, but also maybe on more knowledge about soil quality and things like this? And also, I would like to know what were the difficult parts of the TPP negotiations and what kind of lessons we can learn with the TTIP negotiations. Thank you very much.
Pani poseł Schreier.
Voorzitter, dank u wel. Voorzitter,
Thank you very much, Chairman. Mr. Secretary of State, I must say that your basic approach is a positive one. I came here fearing that I was going to be critical when it comes to pig meat, fruit and vegetable, horticulture, and so on. We tend to be quite defensive, and we tend to say, well, don't agree with TTIP. But when I hear you, then you care about the future of family-run companies in the US and in Europe, and that's something I welcome. It's very different from what we hear from Asia and other countries and blocs. But what is of great importance to us is what do we do with self-determination and competition? How can we make sure enough money ends up on the tables of our farmers? I mean, if that is something we can achieve, then I will certainly not be against TTIP, but I think that's what it boils down to, so that's the main focus for us.
Pan poseł Tarabella, 1 minute.
Mr. Tarabella.
Merci, Président, Monsieur le Secrétaire d'État.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary of State, there are 7 billion people on this world. There was 3.5 billion in 1970, and of course soon will be 9 billion in 2050. So I don't think we'll be able to solve famine in the world. Our producers are suffering, so we need to change tack. And I do welcome the pragmatist approach. You have the Farm Bill, decoupling of aid, your food aid, great amounts being spent since 2011. But it's in the WTO's green box because you call it social aid. So you're clever at negotiating. You're better at it than we are. Now, you yourself said that agriculture is the last pillar. So that's where everything else gets offset. But when it comes to beef, I have a question. You said that there's going to be equivalence. What does that mean? Will there be mutual recognition of standards? Because I think that's bad news for us. Or is there going to be an expert group which looks at convergence? And is that something that you would accept? Thank you.
Pan poseł Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Sì, grazie Presidente. Innanzitutto...
Thank you, Chairman. Let me start off by warmly welcoming the American Secretary of State for Agriculture. It's a true honor for us to be able to meet with you today in our committee. The question that I wanted to raise has been broached by others, but I'd like to couch it in slightly more specific terms. You, sir, made reference to the fact that you can't have two identical markets. You therefore need equivalent systems that exist on one and the same market. You touched upon the precautionary principle, which is something we apply in Europe, and the fact that you have a risk-based assessment in the US. You also mentioned geographic GIs, but the Wall Street Journal said that the world's more American than Parmesan cheese, and I think that's an interesting headline. I think that points to the difference in approach between the US and Europe. But my question then is as follows. In your presentation, you said that GIs and trademarks need to enjoy equivalence. But why don't you just attribute to any GI that we produce the value of trademark in the US? That would solve it.
Pan poseł Bogovič.
Mr. Bogovič.
Hvala za besedo. Lep pozdrav in hvala za vašo prisotnost, spoštovani minister.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us, Minister. You talked about the differences between Europe and America and the similarities. I see that European farms are about 10 times smaller than the US farms. There are other differences in the technologies used here and in the US. For example, when we talk about cloning, hormones, pesticides, which are much more used in the US. Our policies are very different. We talk a lot about greening, about rural development, while the US politics are interventionist and they help when there is a problem with the natural catastrophe or with the market in general. Seeing as our politics, agricultural politics, are not well compatible, do you think that we can still defend the European farmers if we sign this agreement? All of our farmers are very concerned about this agreement, but also we have about 300 or 500,000 consumers which are following this very close and want to see how it will develop. Thank you.
Pani poseł Hojbusz.
Ms. Hojbusz.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Secretary of State, for coming along. I have a question on new animal husbandry techniques. There's a meeting between the Commission, your ministry, and the representatives of the gene technology industry. And my question is, to what extent are you willing to accommodate the gene technology industry's request not to regulate that particular market? The New Zealanders, for example, do want to regulate it, but what are your intentions in the US? Now, you said that consumers are clever and can make a reasonably informed choice. But if I'm correctly informed, then agri-gene technology products are not labelled in the US when they are in Europe. So I think there's some catch-up to play on that score. And you also said that bio, organic farming is on the rise. There are more and more holdings. But how are these organic farms going to be protected against cross-contamination from GMO farms? And if we take in products, should we then accept certain impurities because we have zero tolerance, as you know?
Pani poseł Petir.
Ms. Petir.
Hvala lijepo, gospodine predsjedniče. Ja vjerujem, gospodine ministre, da vi brinete o pravima i zdravlju.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary of State, I'm sure that consumer rights and consumer protection is as important to you as it is to us in Europe. It's just that we approach it in different ways and we use different standards and rules to achieve the same result. And I think there's still a number of outstanding issues. There's a fairly liberal jurisdiction in America, and you tolerate GMO presence in products without that being indicated on the label. We take the view that that's a risk to our consumers. Consumers want to know what they are eating. So could I just ask you, are you planning on changing your laws? Are there any legal changes afoot? Are you planning on labelling your products to take account of that GMO presence? Then hormones in beef production. Again, are you going to convey to your compatriots why we ban that in Europe? Will you explain it to them? I mean, there are pretty compelling arguments to be against these imports? So will you be sort of making representations to your compatriots?
Flanagan. Mr. Flanagan.
Very much interesting to listen to Tom. You particularly focused on not identical but equivalent. I'm just wondering, do you think that chlorinated meat products are the equivalent of non-chlorinated meat products? Do you think GM food is the equivalent of non-GM food? Because words are very important here. You talk about delegating responsibility of feeding our families. If TTIP goes through, we will delegate the responsibility of feeding our families to Walmart and Lidl and Aldi, and they do not give a damn about us. You suggested at the beginning of your speech that you like that kind of fuzzy warm thing about Europe. Now, finally, you talk about consumer choice. If consumers in an area elect a government and elect a council that decides they don't want GM crops in their area, how do you feel about that? Because it's reported that in 2005 you voted in favour of legislation which prohibited consumers in an area prohibiting the use of GMs. I look forward to your answers.
Pan poseł Jara.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender. Vielen Dank, Herr Minister, für...
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary of State, for giving us an opportunity to speak to you. I'll put my question first and then have a comment at the end. My question's pretty straightforward. We've heard a lot about red lines, at least the European red lines. But what are your red lines? What's the bottom line for you, and what interests can't you forsake? Then my comment. Someone from Iowa Falls relocated to my region. I'm a visitor to their region in the US. I'm friends with them, and I must say that what struck me is the very pragmatic approach of American farmers. They're real entrepreneurs. Secondly, I was also impressed by the economic and political clout of the Farmers' Union in Iowa Falls. We could take a leaf out of their book for sure in Europe when it comes to that. Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Minister. Well, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Minister. It's very kind of you to have come along today. Here in Europe, we have very high animal protection standards, and I'm sure that over the next years and decades, those standards will continue to go up, because Europe's citizens don't just want quality and safety of food, but also look at how these animals are reared. There are certain products that people simply no longer want on their plates. And high animal protection standards, of course, will have an impact on producer prices. European farmers are at a competitive disadvantage as a result. And I understand European farmers when they express serious misgivings about the TTIP negotiations, because the cheap price is what will win the day. I don't think consumers can be convinced otherwise. Now, what about you taking on board our standards? That would be good for animal welfare in the US and would certainly allay certain fears when it comes to the TTIP negotiations.
Mr. Selimovic.
Thank you very much, State Secretary, for giving us this opportunity. I have two questions regarding TTIP. The first one is, TTIP is not just a negotiation between the states and between the European Union and United States. It is also about getting the public opinion to accept what is to be agreed. So my question is, what would be the most difficult for the public opinion in the states to give up, and what would be most difficult to accept? And the second question is about in European Union, we are very much aware of the dangers of the antimicrobial resistance, and we are a bit worried about the extensive use of antibiotica in the meat in the States. I would very much like to hear you. How would you tackle that fear and how would you tackle that problem? Thank you very much.
Pani poseł Ribeiro.
Muito obrigada, Sr. Presidente. Sr. Ministro, seja bem-vindo a este...
Thank you very much indeed. Chair, thank you. Minister, thank you for coming here. It's a good sign, I think, for our relations that you are here. And I'm from the Azores, so even more important for me, halfway between Europe and the US. All I can say is that if we have a problem with GIs, denomination of origin, well, here in Europe, in the EP, we won't be accepting TTIP. So I do have a question for you. From what I've understood on GIs, you have talked about a parallel action, some sort of parallel activity. What are we talking about here? What does this mean? All is done in parallel. Will it be within the framework of TTIP or apart from it? And will the FDA be brought in? For denomination of origin, which is obviously important for Portuguese people, we have Madeira, Porto wines. I'd like to know, here again, are you thinking of parallel actions?
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre, pour vos...
Thank you much indeed, Secretary of State. I have two questions for you. Looking at your new agricultural policy, and also when we look at your country signing various trade agreements, a question we have would be, do you think the Marrakesh Agreement has expired at the WTO? That's my first question. Secondly, in a year, we'll have two presidents in the US, if you will, incoming and sitting. Should these negotiations come to an end before US elections, presidential elections, and depending on the results thereof, or rather, if we don't get an agreement, do you think we would get maybe a revision of what's been done in the future presidency?
Poseł Wojciechowski.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to touch on an issue that has been raised by some previous speakers, such as Madame Petier. It's the GMO. In the EU, we are gradually changing our approach to the GMO. It is more and more restrictive, and we are showing more and more care in preventing GMO crops in the individual member states. However, in the United States, the policy there is different. And so my question is, how do you consider, or how do you not consider, in the US, the ever stronger voices of scientists, including American scientists, and we've had some of those at a conference here at the Parliament, saying that the threats related to GMO crops are very serious, which obviously makes our deal very difficult. This is my question. Thank you.
So Kalinowski.
Mr. Kalinowski.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie ministrze.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, a short question. When will the new regulations be published, thanks to which Poland, amongst others, will be entered onto the list of countries that can export their produce to the United States? I mean, apples, amongst others. The publication of that list was awaited this year, but when will it happen? I'd like to add a thing. What is a small farm in your thinking? And what is the amount of agricultural land or arable land that has come out of production in the recent period? Then there's this debate about the recognition of standards in agricultural production. I'm asking all those questions because our the cooperation between the EU and the United States in the global context will require a new approach to technical standards of production. And then my last question would be, what is the most important part in the agricultural part of the TTIP negotiations? Thank you. We've lost the speaker. Microphone for the speaker, please.
Well, there have obviously been a number of questions asked, and I'll do my best to try to respond as quickly as I can to all of them. You've raised some very, very important points. The first question was why we don't necessarily treat the EU as an entire bloc as it relates to SBS issues. And it's a very simple reason, and the best example I can use is the avian influenza situation. Our view is when AI hit the states, 21 states were impacted by it. That meant that there were 29 states that did not have any problem with the poultry that was being produced. If we basically treat the EU as a single bloc, if one country has a problem, then every other country would necessarily suffer the consequence of that. And to our way of thinking, that's not really fair to those who haven't been impacted by a particular disease or problem. That's why we go through a process, which it's a uniform process. We're doing it with beef now. Ireland, the Netherlands, Lithuania is making progress in terms of reopening the beef market. So it is really designed to protect against a one-size-fits-all circumstance if we have a disease situation, and we think that's the fairer way to approach it. We don't think the state of Virginia, which hasn't had AI, should necessarily have its exports banned because something happened in the state of Iowa, which is 1,000 miles away. And I think that's the reason. Question was asked about the TRQ and what level of Irish beef I think is appropriate, and what level of beef and U.S. beef I think is appropriate. Well, let me just simply say that we do have concerns about the current state of the TRQ. Remember, that was established in response to a WTO decision, and it was in lieu of basically sanctions that could have been imposed. And the idea was that we would be, in a sense, provided an opportunity to use the TRQ as a way of offsetting the loss of the beef market. What's happened is over time the EU has allowed a number of other countries' beef to chip away at that TRQ to the point where the U.S. is no longer receiving anywhere near what it thought it was going to receive as a result of the agreement that was reached several years ago. So my first line would be to basically get us to a point where we are at least living up to the spirit of the agreement that was reached in response to the WTO. And then we can talk about what happens after that. But until we get to that point, it's, I think, very difficult to determine what that market ultimately could be. The question was asked about the cost of our Farm Bill programs and why we provided some reforms. Look, nobody in the United States thought it was a good idea to pay farmers when prices were at record highs. That's what we had in the past. We had a direct payment system, and it made no sense when corn was selling for $8 a bushel in the U.S. That a corn farmer would receive a check from the government. It was a program that was very, very difficult to defend to the citizens of the country. So we had to reform it. We had to change it. And what we wanted was a system that provided help when help was needed, but not more or less than what was needed. There was a roughly $23 billion savings to the overall budget from the Farm Bill as passed. We didn't necessarily see a significant increase in the government research budget, but what we did see was the establishment of a privately run but publicly financed research foundation, which is receiving $200 million from the U.S. government. It's going to be matched by at least $200 million from the private sector, so that we create an additional $400 million in research, ag research. I will say the ag research budgets historically have been underfunded, given the challenges that we face, and I think we would be all well to really look at how we might be able to encourage policymakers to provide more resources in that agricultural budget, because we do have serious issues forthcoming relative to climate change, relative to pests and diseases, relative to changing crop rotations and locations. Water, a serious issue that needs to be significantly researched and requires a lot of time and attention in every country and globally. So I would hope that we would see an increase in the research budget. I was struck by the comment that the EU is focused on rural development, to the suggestion that somehow the United States was not. Let me tell you how we see this. Rural development is really important to me. I was not raised in a rural town. I was raised in a big city in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was adopted out of an orphanage, but I was adopted a second time, in a sense, when I met my wife, who was from Iowa, and we went to her small town, and I practiced law in that small town. I represented farmers during the course of the 1980s when there was a reallocation and restructuring of our agricultural economy. Many farmers suffered during that period of time, and I represented them. That was an experience I will never forget. I really learned to value and appreciate and respect these folks who worked the land, how deeply they felt connected to the land. And so I vowed that I would do what I could to create economic opportunity in rural areas. The challenge was that as production agriculture was becoming more efficient, we went from, when my department was established, where 90% of America was rural, we now have to a point where 15% of America is rural. We didn't necessarily overlay production agriculture, the economy that was supported by millions of farmers, we didn't overlay it with a complementary economy. We are now, and it's basically got four cornerstones. Production agriculture, clearly still important. Local and regional food systems, which I talked about earlier, very important for small and mid-sized operators. Conservation, not just for the benefits that conservation brings to soil health and soil condition and avoiding erosion and water quality, but now establishing it as a new market opportunity. There are regulated industries that will need the carbon sequestration capacity of agriculture. Rather than having them build gray infrastructure, we believe it makes sense for them to invest in green infrastructure by essentially investing in conservation that farmers can do. It provides another income source. It expands outdoor recreation, which we also see as a critical component to a healthy rural economy. And then finally, the bio-based economy, using agricultural waste product to produce not just fuel and fiber and energy as it has in the past, but now substituting it for petroleum-based chemicals and materials. We see this bio-based economy as creating processing facilities in rural areas that create jobs, provides an area for agricultural waste, livestock waste, a wide variety of new creative ways. It's now a $364 billion industry in the United States. It employs 4 million people. We think we're just beginning to see the genesis of this new bio-based economy that would potentially provide new income sources for farmers and jobs for those who want to live, work, and raise their families in rural areas. So there is a rural development component to my department, and it is a very significant focus of what I do on a day-to-day basis, because I care about the people who live in those small towns. Because my wife grew up in a small town, my kids grew up in a small town, my friends are from small towns. Those people elected me to my position as a mayor, as a state senator, and as a governor, and I will always work hard to try to make sure they have economic opportunity. A lot of questions about labeling, and right now we have essentially a non-GMO label, which we at USDA have developed a system that anybody who wishes to label their product as non-GMO can go through a process that we have at USDA to establish and to verify that that label is accurate. There is obviously the organic label, which we also operate at USDA. And there is now conversation within the Congress of the United States about the possibility of using this extended barcode or this QR code, and I think you'll probably see major food companies in the U.S. begin to adopt this notion of putting information available for that could be scanned or could be accessed through a smartphone that will provide information, including the fact that the product may contain GMO. You know, it may be all well and good to suggest a zero tolerance system, but as testing mechanisms become more precise, I think it's going to be perfection is going to be difficult to achieve, and so there will probably likely have to be some threshold that will be established, and the Department of Agriculture may be instructed to establish that threshold. But I think over time you will see the ability of consumers to know whether they're buying something organic, something that's not organic but non-GMO, or something that does contain GMO or may contain GMO. And then consumers can make the choice. We think that's the way to approach this. I was asked a question whether or not we have red lines. Ambassador Froman is the trade representative, and he's the one who's got responsibility for negotiating this trade agreement. He would probably not be happy with me if I indicated to you that what our red lines are. I don't think we necessarily have red lines right now. I think there are difficult issues. You've identified a couple of them. Geographic indications. Very difficult issue. Here's why it's a difficult issue. We've got farmers in Iowa, in America, in Wisconsin, in California that produce cheese, which they think they ought to be able to use the generic terms that over time have been associated, mozzarella, Parmesan, whatever. They think that they ought to be able to use those terms because they've been using them for a long time. The folks here believe that they should be exclusively used by those who essentially started the process, who created the process. There are two issues here. One, is there a process for determining whether or not what you say is true, that this particular process started in a particular area, in a particular country? Is there due process to be able to question that? And two, is there an opportunity to have some question as to whether or not a term has been used so long, so often, so commonly that it basically it would be restricting market access to those who have been using that term? And is there another way of providing the opportunity for that geographic area that is producing that product to distinguish itself in the marketplace without preventing someone else who produces the very same product from using that term? And I think that's where we get into the trademark discussion of whether or not that is a vehicle or a mechanism. In the TPP agreement that was recently negotiated, there is a discussion of GIs, and it does create this due process. And I think there is a potential there for conversation as it relates to the very difficult issue that we face. I'm just sort of going down one side. I've got a whole page of questions, so I'm just going down one side. These aren't necessarily in chronological order. The question of elections, look, it's fair to say elections matter, and a new president may have either slightly different views or significantly different views or the same views. My guess is that most of the presidential candidates who are likely to be nominated by their respective parties and who ultimately will become the next president, most of them are supporters of trade and free trade. They may define it differently. They may believe that there are certain aspects of it that a trade agreement must have in order for them to feel comfortable with it. But for the most part, I think all of the major presidential candidates are supportive of trade generally. There are elements within the U.S., as there are in Europe, who feel very strongly about this. And in my party, there are elements in labor. Some farm groups, but not all farm groups, have raised concerns about trade agreements generally. On the other side of ag are most of the major commodity groups, most of the major farm organizations are supportive of trade. This will be a good conversation. Part of the challenge in the U.S., and I obviously can't speak to the situation here in Europe, but part of the challenge in the U.S. is that those who are proponents of trade have not done a particularly good job of articulating the impact of trade in the country. It is very easy in my country for a plant to be closed or for a plant that employs 300 people to be shut down in the U.S. and reopened in some other country, and folks will blame trade on that move. What doesn't happen is when a number of small companies add 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 employees because of trade, there's never the headlines because you never have the aggregation that occurs with a plant closing. It's not quite as newsworthy. So there hasn't been a particularly good job, in my view, of articulating the benefits of trade. Those who have been opposed have done a good job of articulating some of the concerns of trade, and I think this trade debate that we're going to have in the U.S. in the next 6 months or so is going to, I think, inform people across the country about the importance of trade. Questions have been asked about apples and pears. I can tell you that the rule that we are working on is in my department. It is in final clearance. It will be a proposed rule. We expect and anticipate it will be out shortly for discussion and review. So that should occur very, very soon. The issue of food safety is a very it's a very important one. And we have recently passed the Food Safety Modernization Act. Candidly, the U.S. has 15 different agencies in the federal government that are responsible in some way, shape, or form for food safety. I've articulated, the President's articulated the fact that we ought to have a single agency in charge of food safety. What we have attempted to do with the Food Safety Modernization Act is to align it and parallel it with what USDA does in food safety. FDA basically, Food and Drug Administration basically controls roughly 80% of the food products in terms of food safety. USDA's got meat, poultry, and processed eggs. FDA's got everything else. The absurdity is that if you ordered a pizza in the U.S. and it had just cheese on it, the FDA would regulate it. If you put a slice of pepperoni on it, then the USDA would regulate it. Makes no sense to me. So what we're trying to do is first and foremost align the programs, because the FDA's review of food safety was more a response to a food safety outbreak once it occurred. USDA's reaction was, how do you prevent the food safety problem from occurring to begin with? So we have a fairly rigorous inspection process, and we've just recently reformed our inspection process, and we've recently expanded the number of adulterants that we look for. We have recent changes in product that will be tested. If there's a problem, it can be held and not put in commerce. So we wanted to make sure that with the Food Safety Modernization Act that we better aligned the food safety systems so that at some point in time it would be easier, should there be the move to create a single agency, that there wouldn't it would be easier to do. And you know, I think it's obviously important to have accountability and responsibility. It's important to be able to respond to a food safety outbreak as quickly as possible, to be able to trace it back as quickly as possible. And with 300 million consumers and over 1 trillion opportunities during the year for a problem, it's obviously very, very important. Sustainability, animal welfare. Our cattle industry has a very good definition of sustainability, and it takes into consideration not just social sustainability, which animal welfare rules would fall under. It also includes environmental sustainability and economic sustainability. And frankly, if you're going to have a sustainability system, you can't have one or two of them. You have to have all three. Because you could have the highest standards in the world, but if nobody could afford to do them, they aren't going to be enforced. You could have the cheapest standards in the world, in which case you would have problems with animal welfare or environment. So our view is to try to figure out ways in which we can have sustainability in total. And on animal welfare, we are working and will continue to work with OIE to try to create the international standards so that there's clear definition as to what is required and that there's transparency as to what is required. And I think our folks will respond. I think also the market is playing an extraordinary role in this. Consumers are demanding, and the market is responding. Some of our largest fast food restaurants are now changing their way of doing business just because consumers are demanding it. I think you'll continue to see more of that. There was a discussion about the difference between equivalent and identical systems, and a lot of specific questions about that. I'm frank to say that requires a level of discussion that probably time doesn't permit today, but let me just point out what I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to get at, and an example is in the biofuel area, you support the notion of biofuel, but you support it only if the feedstock for the biofuel was sustainably produced. Our soybean growers believe that they are sustainably producing soybeans. They don't do exactly the way it's done here, but they think they get to the same end result through the process that they use. To us, that is an equivalent but not an identical system. And that to me is where, if you define what it is that you want to, the goal that you want to obtain, the question then is there only one way to get to that goal, or are there multiple ways to get to the goal? If there are multiple ways, then you can have equivalent systems that aren't necessarily identical. And I think as these discussions in TTIP unfold, there's going to be a lot of conversation about what is it that we're trying to get at, what's the result, and is there only one way to get to it? The GI issue is a good one. Is the GI the only way to get to protecting the high-value proposition, or is the trademark system another way of getting to that, or is there some combination that could potentially be developed? You ask about the definition of small farm. Let me just tell you that there are 2.2 million farmers in the United States of America as we define farmer. And a farmer is defined as anyone who produces product which has a value, a saleable value of $1,000 or more. That's a pretty broad definition of farmer. But within that 2.2 million, you have roughly 1.3 million farmers who produce product that's probably less than $10,000 in value. So the vast majority of people that we define as farmers or the majority of people we define as farmers are in that category. They produce less than 10,000. They probably have something going on in the back of their home. They probably take it down to a farmer's market. They may take it to a local cider mill and produce apple cider during the fall. Then secondly, there are roughly 700,000 producers that produce something more than 10,000 but less than $250,000 in value. They are what people in the United States would commonly refer to as family farming operations, smaller to mid-sized operators. Those are the people that you would define in the U.S. as family farms. And then that leaves roughly 200,000, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000, producers who produce more than 250,000. Those are the larger scale production farmers. Now, they produce a substantial percentage of what we produce in the U.S., but in terms of numbers, they are relatively small. The vast majority of farmers in the country are small to mid-sized and sell less than 250,000. Almost all of the farmers in either the less than 10,000 or less than 250,000 category, almost all of them, either themselves or their spouses, have to work off the farm, which is why we're trying to create a companion economy that allows them new job opportunities or potentially new income sources that would make it easier for them to keep the farm without necessarily having to work two jobs. Because we are faced with a situation where young people who see how hard their moms and dads work are not necessarily enamored with the notion of farming. The last point that I'll make is the issue of organic and GMO. How do they coexist within the U.S.? This is a discussion we started a couple of years ago in a program we call AC21. It's a group of 21 folks who represent a broad array, the diversity of American agriculture. There are GMO producers, there are organic producers, there are thought leaders in agriculture. I challenge them to think about how organic and GMO and conventional identity preserved folks could coexist. They came up with a set of recommendations. One of them involves stewardship and the need for producers to understand what their neighbors were doing, and the need for seed companies to make sure that they are cognizant of the right time and the right method and the right location for the planting of seed to avoid any problem, and to work collaboratively together to reduce the risk. Secondly, there was the need for additional risk management tools for organic producers, and we've changed the way in which insurance is available to organic producers. We've changed the way in which they are compensated if they have a problem. Third is a matter of doing additional research on drift. We have been doing research, and we've had some pretty interesting discoveries relative to drift in terms of not being as significant as many of us thought it was in at least a couple of crops, alfalfa being one of them. Then finally, we also have done a survey of organic producers to ask the question, how many of you have had a contamination issue? And it is a really, really, really small number. The question was asked, how many organic producers are there in the United States? That's an interesting question. There are roughly 20,000 people who have been officially certified as organic. I think there are probably others who market themselves as organic, who haven't necessarily gone through the certification process, but who have been able to satisfy the requirements. But the official number is roughly 20,000. And I've got to check. So mention was made of a 2005 vote. I don't know what that vote was because I was a governor at the time. I wasn't in a legislature. I wasn't voting, so I'm not quite sure what that is. But if you want to get me more information about it, I'll be glad to try to give you an explanation and explain what it was. Well, you know, I've found that newspapers aren't always correct about things, but well, that may be true. I think I've covered most of the questions, at least most of them. I may have missed a few, but it's been a good, healthy discussion.
Mr. Secretary, we've had so many questions and so diverse.
Wyrazem podziękowania.
I'd like to thank you, and this applause is a thank you for you, for what you've said. I'd like to come back to what you said in the beginning. If I well remember, you said that American agriculture is not well understood, abroad especially. I think it is an important message indeed, because we get the impression too sometimes that our agriculture is not well understood within the EU. Something's happening there, but it's a specific branch of industry, and it's not easy to compare it to other sectors of the economy. And when you were talking about food security and safety, I believe the TTIP should serve this goal, should it not? It should lead us towards an important communitization of broadly understood agricultural matters in a global approach. Because, you know, that's what globalization is about. That's what has happened already to the financial sector and elsewhere, and it's happening also within agriculture. Although there too we need some state intervention, because the market itself, the free market itself, will not cope. When we think of financial institutions, it seems that market instruments have an easier life there than in many other sectors. In agriculture, the growth or loss of production may be due to climatic factors. So we need to think about these things. We could be 10 billion in 2050. And if by then the consumption of protein in the Asian middle class grows, then we'll have problems. We'll have a problem with water, we'll have a problem with land grabbing, we'll have other issues too, such as other problems related to climate change. And all this will be a burden, and a significant one, for agriculture. So I think our view there is very, very similar. Having listened to you, Mr. Secretary, one might think that European agriculture is indeed very close to American agriculture. However, my view is that the differences are deeper, though, because we know what diversity we have even within Europe. The agriculture in the south is quite different from that in the north of Europe, and these differences are perhaps greater than in the US. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much once again. I'm sure that will be coming back to the information that you provided us, and I think that this exchange of views has been very beneficial. You have the word.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me thank you again for this opportunity, and I certainly appreciate the time and attention that you all have given me today. I would just say two things in closing. One, Europe has a great reputation. European farmers, European products have a great reputation, and it's a high value-added proposition. It's the kind of proposition that American consumers are particularly interested in. That's why there is such a significant trade imbalance between the EU and the U.S. on ag products, in part because you sell a very high-value product. And earlier the question was, well, you know, how can Europe survive in this process? And I think it survives by continuing to focus on this high-value proposition. But regardless, we collectively, those of us who are interested in farming, those of us who are interested in agriculture and farms, we have two major problems. One is we're going to be confronted with serious challenges relative to climate, and we've got to get, as an industry, as a people, as a global entity, we have to get serious about it. And obviously, we're going to try to provide some focus on that in Paris. And secondly, as it relates to trade agreements, I've always been concerned about ag's relative position relative to all other aspects of an economy. Because the number of farmers in America is relatively small, it oftentimes is a circumstance where agricultural issues are not necessarily at the top of the negotiation list. It may be autos, or it may be pharmaceuticals, or it may be biologics. It may be a series of other things that are really, really important to the economy. But at the end of the day, the comment that was made earlier, and that is if we don't support the farmers and they go out of business, it won't make any difference what the auto agreement is. We've got to make sure that agriculture, that folks who are negotiating, leaders in all countries, understand and appreciate the important role that farmers play, and have a level of respect, and this is primarily for people in my country, a level of respect and appreciation for farmers, because we've delegated that very serious responsibility to a relatively small group of folks, and they've given us the freedom to pursue our dreams, and we never ever thank them for it, and we should. So, thank you.